I'm going to be talking about paradoxes of populism during the pandemic, and I'll organize my talk around three paradoxes: the paradox of expertise, the paradox of crisis, and the paradox of protection. The paradox of expertise is that populism, which is generally understood as hostile to expertise, can flourish during a medical emergency that has made expertise more indispensable than ever. The paradox of crisis is that populism, which thrives on crisis, and indeed often depends on fabricating a sense of crisis, now accuses mainstream politicians and the media of overblowing and even inventing the corona crisis. The paradox of protection is that populism, which is ordinarily protectionist, is now anti-protectionist. It challenges the allegedly overprotective nanny state, and instead of advocating closure against threatening forms of openness, it demands the reopening of spaces that had been closed in the name of protecting health and saving lives. A few clarifications and qualifications before I jump in. First, populism is too solid a word for what I will be talking about. It reifies and substantializes what I prefer to think of as a discursive and stylistic repertoire, a set of tropes, gestures, and stances. Second, this is not a talk about populist movements, parties, or leaders, but about an amorphous complex of tropes and gestures. Third, I'm not arguing that the politicization of the pandemic is best understood through the analytical lens of populism. This is just one of many relevant analytical angles. And lastly, I'll be talking almost exclusively about the US. Some of my themes will have parallels elsewhere, but much of what I have to say will reflect the distinctiveness of the American experience of the pandemic. And it will also reflect the distinctive salience of anti-intellectualism, libertarian anti-statism, and myths of self-reliance in American culture. So let me start with the paradox of expertise. How can there be much room for populism, and specifically for its relentless attacks on experts and expertise, at a moment when experts and expertise seem more indispensable than ever? The pandemic has obviously increased the demand for experts, not only as advisors to decision makers, but also as communicators to the public. It has dramatically increased the influence, the visibility, and the accessibility of virologists, infectious disease epidemiologists, and other public health experts. But precisely this influence, this visibility, and this accessibility have made that expertise vulnerable to populist attack. The paradox of expertise, in short, is only an apparent paradox. Expertise is vulnerable to challenge and attack, not in spite of its being indispensable, but precisely because it is indispensable and because the stakes are so high. There's nothing new about this vulnerability. The inexorably increasing scientization of politics, as Gil Eyal put it, necessarily brings in its train the politicization of science. Expertise is continually called upon to help rationalize and legitimize policy decisions that necessarily advantage some and disadvantage others. In the present crisis, decisions justified with respect to expertise have devastated and existentially threatened some, while merely inconveniencing others. So it's no surprise that expertise would come under attack. The influence of epidemiologists has indeed been truly unprecedented. Never before, arguably, has so narrow a network of experts exerted so decisive and incalculably far-reaching an effect on the course of world events, upending the lives of billions and plunging the world into its deepest economic crisis since the Great Depression. The lockdowns initially enjoyed very broad public support, and restrictive measures still enjoy the support of a substantial majority. But as they moved into their second and now their third month, and as the medical emergency has become less immediately and urgently threatening, these drastic measures and the expert advice on which they were predicated have become an irresistible focal point for popular anger and frustration. Besides the extraordinarily concentrated, consequential, and visible influence of expertise, I want to highlight two additional factors. The first is the gap between what people know relatively directly from common sense and personal experience on the one hand, and what people know about from expert models and projections on the other. This epistemic gap gives rise to what I will call the experiential challenge to expertise. The second factor is the hyper-accessibility of expertise. And this factor gives rise to what I'll call the participatory challenge to expertise. So first, the experiential challenge. Populism tends to valorize common sense and concrete personal experience, and it tends to distrust abstract and experience-distant forms of knowledge. It's easy to see how the corona crisis has activated this distrust. The extreme unevenness of the pandemic has created a huge discrepancy between what many people have seen in their own local surroundings, few illnesses, fewer deaths, and empty hospitals, for example, and the dire picture reported from hotspots or projected for the country as a whole. Half of America's approximately 3,000 counties had not reported a single COVID-19 death when I checked a couple weeks ago, and more than 80% of counties had reported fewer than 10 deaths. So many residents of rural and small town America could easily think that the crisis was overblown and the lockdown unnecessary. As one Oklahoma protester put it, we're not New York. Their problems are not our problems. The unevenness in geographic space is reinforced by an unevenness in social space. We all know about the disproportionate vulnerability of the inner city poor, of minorities and African Americans in particular, of the incarcerated, and of immigrant workers in meatpacking plants. This may reinforce the tacit or explicit sense on the part of residents of low prevalence areas that this is not their pandemic, but one that afflicts others. Anti-lockdown protesters could easily draw, at least implicitly, on the long-standing and of course deeply racialized trope that contrasts the morally, politically, and even biomedically healthy heartland, the so-called real America of locally rooted communities and virtuous, hardworking, ordinary citizens, with the big cities, seen as sites of corruption, criminality, and disease, and understood as dominated by liberal cosmopolitan elites on the one hand, and by racial, ethnic, religious, sexual, and gender minorities on the other. I don't want to overstate the centrality of this way of thinking. Even in the so-called heartland, restrictive measures retain considerable bipartisan support, and the vulnerability of the health compromised, the elderly, and especially the institutionalized elderly, leads many people in the heartland to take the pandemic seriously. But there's also a temporal aspect to the epistemic gap between local experience and expert knowledge. And this is relevant not only in rural and small town America. Epidemiological time is exponential time. Given an easily transmissible pathogen, a small outbreak can quickly become a disaster. The urgency of expert warnings and the case for stringent distancing depended on this exponential temporality. Yet precisely because the warnings were taken seriously, they could become self-discrediting, since the lockdowns in effect suspended exponential temporality, and the projected catastrophe never happened. This is what is sometimes called the paradox of prevention. Measures taken to avert an outcome, if they are successful, can be seen in retrospect as having been unnecessary. So here too, the epistemic gap between local experience and expert projections can breed suspicion and distrust of expertise. I turn now to the participatory challenge to expertise. Here, expertise is challenged not on the terrain of everyday experience and common sense, but on the terrain of data. The participatory challenge feeds off what I will call the hyper-accessibility of expertise. Now, by hyper-accessibility, I don't, of course, mean that it's easy to acquire expertise, however that slippery term is defined. I mean rather that expert opinions, expert models and projections, expert research, and expertise-relevant data are more accessible and more abundant than ever. Experts have not simply advised governments, they've also been keen to address the public. They've sought to build support for disruptive distancing measures, but they've also sought to enlist the public in altering their behavior, and thereby in altering the course of the event that they seek to model. Experts have addressed the public both directly through op-ed, contributions, interviews, podcasts, and Twitter posts, and indirectly by talking extensively with journalists. Their views, along with journalists' simplifying accounts of those views, have then been recirculated at high velocity, though often, of course, in fragmented and distorted form, by legions of digitally active lay users. But it's not only expert opinions that are hyper-accessible, it's also the raw materials on the basis of which experts' opinions are formed and revised. That is, the projections, the research findings, and the public health data. You've all seen the many tracking projects that convey daily updates and trends on cases, deaths, tests, and hospitalizations. Many of these allow users to download the raw data so sophisticated users can easily explore the data on their own. Equally accessible are the numerous forecasting undertakings, which seek to predict future trajectories of cases, deaths, and hospitalizations. And voluminous streams of new research are freely accessible on preprint servers, not only published work, but also papers that have not yet been peer-reviewed. So there's just an enormous glut of data and research findings. I want to note two implications of this hyper-accessibility and superabundance of COVID-related expertise, research, and data. One is the proliferation of the means of assessing expertise. For what is accessible in the digital public sphere, or what appears to be accessible, is not only the content of expert opinion, but also the evidence that supports or undermines it. It's easy to find data or new research that can be taken, or of course mistaken, as suggesting or even proving, as some would claim, that the experts got it wrong in one way or the other. For example, it's easy to cite research and numbers that suggest that COVID-19 is much less dangerous than the experts claim, indeed no more dangerous than the seasonal flu. And it's easy, therefore, to claim that the lockdown was a catastrophic mistake, the greatest mistake in history, as one commentator rather grandly put it. A second implication is the ease of claiming and exercising expertise, or at least some kind of quasi-expertise. Semi-experts, quasi-experts, pseudo-experts, and lay experts have proliferated. And even if it's not easy to claim expertise per se, it's at least easy to claim the right to join in as a knowledgeable participant in the collective public effort to interpret and define socio-medical reality. As one prominent lockdown skeptic, a self-described Silicon Valley growth hacker, put it, you don't need a special degree to understand what the data says and doesn't say. The participatory challenge to expertise is not new. It has roots in long-term developments in the cultural politics of knowledge. These include the decline of what might be called epistemic deference, the long-standing suspicion of insular forms of expert judgment, the valorization of various forms of lay expertise, and the growing sense, especially in health and lifestyle domains, that people must educate themselves and take responsibility for adjudicating between competing expert claims. But the pandemic and the flood of data that it has unleashed have given a major new impetus to this participatory challenge, and this may further discredit and destabilize expertise. There's of course much more to be said about the populist challenge to COVID expertise, but I want to turn now to the paradox of crisis. And here I will be extremely brief. Populism thrives on crisis, even depends on crisis. Populists often seek to cultivate, to exacerbate, or even to create a sense of crisis. Yet we now see a curious reversal. It's now populists who accuse mainstream politicians and media, and of course public health experts as well, of blowing the corona crisis out of all proportion. It's true that some populist leaders in power have embraced the crisis and used it to justify emergency measures that have tightened their authoritarian grip on power. In opposition, however, the dominant populist tendency has been to downplay the seriousness of the pandemic and to turn the tables by accusing incumbents of exploiting the crisis in order to illegitimately expand state power, suspend rights, and to deepen surveillance. The paradox, then, is that instead of performing crisis, populism seems here to be performing non-crisis, to be performing normality in the face of an establishment in full crisis mode. But the paradox is only apparent. Populists are, in fact, seeking to capitalize on crisis, but the crisis on which they seek to capitalize is the economic crisis, not the medical crisis. And because of the unevenness of the pandemic, the economic crisis has seemed much more threatening to many than the medical crisis. Populists have also been seeking to stage and provoke a political crisis. This has been particularly true of the anti-lockdown protesters. The emergency regulations issuing from the overblown medical crisis, in their view, have created a genuine political crisis. This is cast as a crisis of governmental overreach that tramples on fundamental rights, including the right to work, the right to move in public space, the right to free exercise of religion, the right to bear arms, the right to protest, and the right to privacy. I turn now to my third and final paradox, the paradox of protection. We think of populism as protectionist. In recent years, this has meant claiming to protect the people economically, demographically, culturally, and physically from threats arising from unchecked globalization, from the neoliberal economy, from open borders, and from cosmopolitan culture, all seen as favored by economic, political, and cultural elites. Yet faced with the coronavirus, populism appears as anti-protectionist. Populists have taken the side of openness against closure, and they have challenged what they see as the overprotective nanny state. They have cast the lockdowns as hysterical overreactions, and they've criticized paths to reopening as overcautious. They've challenged mask requirements and sometimes mocked social distancing protocols. The paradox is heightened by the fact that conservatives, and American anti-lockdown protesters have been overwhelmingly conservative, generally tend to be more sensitive than liberals to signs of threat and danger, including threats of germs. Now, I was initially inclined to argue that the paradox of protection, like my other two paradoxes, was only an apparent paradox. I was going to argue that the populism of lockdown opponents has indeed been protectionist, but that it has focused on protecting livelihoods and liberties rather than lives. But I don't think this is quite right. The demand to restore individual liberties in the context of emergency restrictions is a libertarian argument, and I don't think it can be plausibly characterized as protectionist. Economic demands could be framed in protectionist terms, for example, as a demand for state action to protect jobs or to protect people from losing their health insurance or from being evicted from their homes. But this argument has not been made by anti-lockdown protesters. So I think there is a real paradox here, or at least a puzzle. Why has populism turned anti-protectionist during the pandemic? Part of the answer, I think, is that populism, unlike socialism or liberalism or conservatism, is not a substantive political ideology. It's substantively empty. Populism is relational and oppositional, defined by what it opposes. What it opposes is formally always the same. It's always anti-elite, it's always anti-establishment, but it's substantively variable, depending on how the opposition between the people and the elite or the establishment is constructed. Populism in the global north has indeed been strongly protectionist in recent decades. This made political sense in the context of hyperglobalization and hegemonic neoliberalism, in which economic, political, and cultural elites could plausibly be seen as indifferent to the bounded solidarities of community and nation. But today, there is no political profit in a protectionist critique of the status quo, since closed borders, renationalization, and deglobalization are the status quo. But if populism cannot just now take a distinctively protectionist stance vis-a-vis the outside world, since that protectionist space is already occupied, it can take a distinctively anti-protectionist stance vis-a-vis the domestic protectionist regime. The regime of protection can be characterized in populist terms as a project of political, cognitive, public health, mainstream media, and professional elites. These elites, so runs the argument, are at best inconvenienced by the regime of protection. They can work from home, they can continue to draw their salaries, they can afford the luxury of hyperprotection. They can afford to minimize the risk of contagion at the expense of everything else. The elites are also seen as moralizing and school teacherish, as inclined to lecture ordinary people about how they should behave. On this account, the people cannot afford the luxury of lockdown-level hyperprotection. But the populist claim is also that the people don't need or want that degree of protection. Gendered imagery, which is often central to populism, comes into play here as well. The people are seen as tough, resilient, brave, and willing to take risks. The elite as soft, coddled, anxious, oversensitive, and risk-averse. Gender symbolism is also central to the cultural politics of mask wearing, though of course the performance of unmasked virility forgets that masks are much less about protecting oneself than about protecting others. Populist skepticism of corona protectionism aligns with a broader popular skepticism of elite overprotectiveness in culture, education, and everyday life. This is a skepticism toward what one prominent book has called safetyism, referring to the efforts of anxious parents to protect their children from even the most minimal of risks, and to the demand for safe spaces and for the protection of students' feelings in American universities. Now, of course, I don't want to conflate this broad cultural shift towards recognizing new categories of vulnerability and protecting people from new kinds of harms with public health measures designed to slow the spread of COVID-19. But it's plausible to think that populist opposition to corona protectionism may draw some of its energy from this broader current of skepticism. I come now to my conclusion. The pandemic has not generated a coherent or large-scale populist response, but the lockdowns have created a reservoir of popular anger, and they have fostered the emergence of what might be called a populist mood among substantial parts of the population. They have heightened distrust of expertise, exacerbated antipathy to intrusive government regulation, and amplified skepticism toward elite overprotectiveness. Could these forms of proto-populist discontent coalesce in a narrative according to which misguided and out-of-touch experts, power-hungry regulators, and excessively risk-averse elites combined to wreck the economy, destroy livelihoods, and trample on liberties? Might such a narrative gain broad public support? This might seem far-fetched, but it cannot be excluded, nor can other scenarios that might today seem grossly implausible given reassuring opinion polls that show support for continued distancing measures. What makes the present moment so fraught, I would argue, is that the dynamics of medical, economic, political, and epistemic crises interpenetrate in complex and utterly unforeseeable ways. The future course of the pandemic, for example, itself depends on many complexly interacting processes. Among these are what people know about the pandemic and how they act on that knowledge, whether they wear masks, for example, and whether and how they practice social distancing, as well as what decisions are taken about modalities and timing of reopening. But what people know about the pandemic is embedded in polarized media ecosystems and colored by the challenges to expertise that I have described. And how they act depends not only on what they think or know, but also on the social pressures and expectations in their immediate social environment. Decisions about modalities and timing of reopening, for their part, respond both to contested knowledge about the dynamics of the pandemic and to political pressures generated by the economic crisis and filtered through the prism of hyperpolarized partisan politics. If the curve of infections turns moderately upward as a result of these and other complex interactions, this will generate new claims to knowledge and new pressures for action. But these new knowledge claims will surely remain deeply contested and beset with deep uncertainty. They will yield no unambiguous and uncontested guidelines for action. The crisis of expertise is likely to deepen, and with it, the political crisis over how to respond to the pandemic, especially under the horizon of an approaching election. And this, of course, only begins to scratch the surface of the complex interpenetration of medical, economic, political, and epistemic crises. We should not complacently assume that the past is a good guide to the future. We are truly in uncharted territory. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rogers. Our next speaker is Tariq Modood, who is professor of sociology, politics, and public policy at the University of Bristol, where he's also the founding director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship. He was awarded an MBE for services to social sciences and ethnic relations in 2001, made a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in 2004, and elected a fellow of the British Academy in 2017. Modood has held over 40 grants and consultancies, has over 35 co- and single authors, authored and edited books and reports, and over 200 articles and chapters. His latest book is Essays on Secularism and Multiculturalism from 2019. Over to you, Tariq.
Thank you very much. In fact, thank you, Inga and Katrine, for hosting this. And I'm very pleased to be part of it. So I'd like to present on what I'm calling multicultural nationalism. Whenever I've ever mentioned it in any other place, the first thing quite a lot of people say is, surely that's an oxymoron. So I'd better say what I mean by nationalism. And I actually do have some slides, but technology has defeated me on this occasion. I can't seem to be able to share them with you. So I'll just talk through my slides. So I offer a two-step definition of nationalism. The first step is to offer a minimal definition, which is a societal perspective or a politics that gives normative significance to the national. Of course, that's, very thin, and it's to capture, as much of the phenomenon of different kinds of nationalisms as possible. But then the next step of the definition is, and it connects it to other things that have normative significance. So it connects the significance of the normative to other things that have normative significance. And if you like, putting it very simply, the more things it connects it to, the more national it is, and so if it were, moves in a maximal directions. So this has some implications. One is that, of course, as I've just said, and everyone would agree, I'm sure, nationalism is varied, but it also means that to accept one kind of nationalism is not to necessarily accept another. And that might seem obvious, but nevertheless, it is something I often find myself arguing with people, saying, oh, you're just offering a version of nationalism, therefore you must somehow bear the burden of all the things that are wrong with all the other nationalisms that you're not arguing for. Another implication is that while othering or exclusion is involved in some kinds of nationalism, of course, on my account, it is not part of the core definition. You know, othering and exclusion is not part of the core definition, as it is for quite a lot of other accounts. And in any case, it does not capture the normative character of nationalism. So having said that my definition is about making normative connections to the national, what is it that I'm trying to connect to the national? Well, firstly, the state. Secondly, citizenship. Thirdly, belonging. Now you might say, well, there's nothing particularly original about this, and I don't claim that there is. Of course, in many accounts of nationalism, perhaps all those three would be included in some way or another. So the distinctive part of what I want to argue for is the fourth normative connection I want to make in addition to those three. And that is that I want to connect it to multicultural recognition or multicultural inclusion. And it's worth emphasizing here, or just at least pointing out, that all of the above, all the four that I mentioned, have some historical cultural character which cannot be reduced to rights. Hence, what I'm calling multicultural nationalism is a culturalist as well as a civic nationalism. Something I'll say a little bit more about right at the very end. So let me now say something about multiculturalism to explain what I'm saying can be connected to nationalism. I take part of the normative core of multiculturalism to be two related concepts of equality, or if you like, a double aspected concept of equality. The first concept, or the first part, is broadly speaking, I think, what we would recognize as classical liberal equality. It is the equality of equal rights and of non-discrimination, and of where it's possible to make claims against unfairness or inequality by arguing on a comparative basis. For example, if Christians are allowed to do this, why aren't Muslims? If Christians are allowed to ring bells on Sunday and at various other times, why aren't Muslims allowed to broadcast the azan and so on? So basically an argument for, as it were, a consistent or uniform or non-discriminatory equality. Before I turn to the second concept, I do want to just unpack this first concept a bit more. Because if we seek equality, you know, one person or one group wanting to make a claim of equality by comparing what others already have, there are basically two ways, two directions one can move. One can have what I call equalizing downwards. So you could say, if say, a religious minority complains that the state is not funding schools proposed by this religious community or one of its organizations, it may say, well, Christians have their schools funded by the state in some form or other. Why can't we have the same? And the response can take two directions. There can be an equalizing downwards response. Someone can say, yes, you're absolutely right. You are being treated unfairly. We will now dispossess Christians of this right that you have identified, this privilege that they have, and then they will be on the same level as you. The two of you will be equal. But on the whole, I mean, I wouldn't say it's always the case, but on the whole, multiculturalists are usually seeking a logic of equalizing upwards. Muslims, when they make arguments like this, or another religious minority in, countries where they're a minority, usually want what Christians have. They're not seeking to dispossess what Christians have. They're wanting to join in, share in. So that's an important point to bear in mind when thinking about this first concept of equality and its multiculturalist uses. I turn now to the second concept of equality, and in which, in many ways, is, if you like, the distinctive multiculturalist contribution to contemporary recent discussions about equality. And this is equality as respect for difference, which can require differential treatment, not uniform, but differential treatment, as the important thing is to focus on a group's needs, as well as on what provision is generally available, because obviously there will be a contextual character to what, political claims are made, can be made, and so on. So, for example, to take a very simple example, on the whole, nowadays, in Western Europe at least, Christians don't have any dietary needs that need to be met at school. They used to, but they don't seem to at the moment. But other groups organized by faith do make dietary requirements. They ask for kosher food, or halal food, or vegetarian food, and so on. And on this second concept of equality, the respect for difference and the meeting of needs based on a respect for difference, it is not a reason to deny Muslims and Jews kosher or halal meals on the ground that, well, why should you have this? No one else gets this. Christians have given up asking for this. Why should we provide you with this? That's not a legitimate multiculturalist response. So the second concept of equality doesn't simply use as a baseline what others have, what, as it were, the majority have, or what the norm is. So from these two concepts of equality, I'd like to draw out 4 more implications of what I'll call multicultural equality. It would have worked so well with slides, but I hope I can still get it across. So the first one is protection from and challenging racism, cultural racism, and Islamophobia, including in dominant or majority culture in relation to laws, rules, or opportunity structures, and representation. That is to say, how groups are publicly represented. So it involves challenging stereotypes and negative portrayals of minorities and allowing minorities to replace them with positive images. So it's basically, if you like, from misrecognition to recognition. But the important point that I want to highlight is this is not challenging the majority culture per se. It's not something that there's something wrong with the majority culture, lock, stock and barrel, but those aspects of it which are, you know, racist, Islamophobic, othering minorities and so on. The second aspect of what I want to say about multicultural equality then is that there should be no insistence on assimilation, but nor should there be any hindrance against uncoercive social processes of assimilation or self-chosen assimilation. Different modes of integration should be equally welcomed. So there's no single top-down model of integration. Integration is understood as, in any case, a two-way thing, and which may take different form for different groups. For example, for a group whose religion needs to be accommodated, in contrast to a group where that is not such a major issue. So we don't create a single model or template of integration and impose that regardless of a minority's character and needs and so on. Because for a multiculturalist, the differential character of minorities and their needs is, of course, very important to equality in the way that I just explained. The third point here is that there should be multicultural accommodation of minorities within shared public institutions. So if I stick with the example that I've used so far, namely of schools, state schools, or what is sometimes called the common school, I personally think there's an argument to have a compulsory school subject like religious education, you know, in the way that we have compulsory religious subjects like history or geography or a particular language like English or French or maths and science and so on. I think there is an argument for that, and it would be taught to all the class and taught as a whole, regardless of what faith they were or if they were of no faith, or that wouldn't be an issue. Just they'd be taught that subject just as they taught any other school subject. But in addition to that, I think that on a voluntary basis, the school should offer in some form or other within the timetable or perhaps outside the timetable, some forms of religious instruction or worship, if they're requested, which are faith specific. And this should be the case, just like with the school meals example, even if the majority doesn't want it for itself, because it may well be the case that people of, you know, parents of Christian background say, oh, don't bother with this. We'll take care of our own children's religious education, either by sending them to Sunday school or by not offering them that. But we don't want the school to do it. And of course, they're perfectly entitled to say that. What they're not entitled to say on the multiculturalist argument is, and therefore no other minority can ask for what we're not asking for. Just because Christians don't want it, it doesn't follow that Jews or Sikhs or Muslims or Hindus can't say, well, actually, we would like to have some kind of religious assembly on Friday afternoon, or last thing at school before people go home, or in the lunch hour, or whatever it may be. The fourth and this fourth final aspect I wanted to mention is that minorities should be able to make claims on national culture and identity in their own ways. And this remaking of national identity is part of multicultural citizenship and should be welcomed and encouraged by the majority. You know, rethinking what it means to be British so that it's not just about being white or Christian or secular. This is, of course, quite a kind of an advanced claim of equality, and one that can't be met by just a few actions or changes of policy or law or whatever. In fact, they can't be met in one go. It'll be a kind of progressive, dialogical change. And of course, it'll take time and so on. So it's kind of a long-term part, but nevertheless an essential part of my understanding of multicultural equality and therefore multicultural nationalism. Moving towards a conclusion, it'll be useful if I distinguish what I'm arguing for from what is sometimes called liberal nationalism. Because of course it does bear some comparison, some overlap connection with liberal nationalism, for instance, as argued by David Miller, or as a kind of tendency that is present in a number of West European polities today. And I've just mentioned two key differences. Firstly, it should be clear that what I'm arguing for is about group recognition, including ethno-religious groups, and it's not just about individual rights, the normal schedule of rights as understood by liberals, or about redistribution, which liberals or social democrats see as an extension of individual rights, or nor is it about secularized public space, which can also be an essential feature of certain liberal and or Republican nationalist understandings. So that's one difference. The second difference is my difference from an idea which I suppose probably comes from Rawls, at least as a tendency. We get it in Will Kimlicker's account of his own multiculturalism or multicultural citizenship, where he argues that multicultural citizenship and inclusion involves the thinning of the national culture to make sure that minorities don't feel alienated by it. Now, I hope it's apparent that I'm not arguing for that. If anything, I'm arguing for the opposite. I'm arguing for a pluralistic thickening of the national culture. For instance, the national culture as taught in schools. So it is additive, not subtractive, to use a Charles Taylor phrase. And so I think that what I'm arguing for works with and builds on, not rejects, current forms of national identity, especially those that are being multiculturalized, as I think in Canada, the United States, and in Britain, though not necessarily as much as I would like or other multiculturalists would like, and certainly not without a lot of political contestation, and perhaps in recent years even reversals. So I'm moving now to my conclusion, which is that multicultural nationalism unites the concerns of some of those currently sympathetic to majoritarian nationalism. I hope that is clear. I haven't made a point of bringing that out, so I should just say, I hope it's clear, because what I'm arguing for is not against majority culture, what might be called majority culture, or national consciousness. And therefore, in a sense, it's not, it at least connects with, it's not antithetical to those who are sympathetic to majoritarian nationalism in some respects. And yet at the same time, it unites those concerns and people with those who are pro-diversity. And if we think that in our publics, in our electorates, and I think this is true of Britain, but it's probably true of a number of countries, that our publics are divided roughly along the lines of a third are very sympathetic to majoritarian nationalism, a third are pro-diversity, and another third are somewhere in the middle, could be pulled, some could be pulled to one side or to another, depending on exactly the way arguments were framed or exactly what was at issue and so on. If that's the case, I would like to say, I'd like to think that multicultural nationalism, what I've been describing to you, represents the political idea and tendency most likely to offer a feasible alternative rallying point to monocultural nationalism. Because surely one of the big questions today is, what is a feasible alternative, political alternative to right-wing populist mono-nationalism? And feasible here, of course, means, something around which a winning political consensus can be built. And I'd like to think that what I've been describing is a good candidate for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tariq. And thank you, Rogers, for both of you for very interesting discussions and talks. Now, I would like to give both of you a few minutes to comment on each other's presentations. So please, maybe you can start, Rogers.
Sure. Well, thank you, Tariq. It's always a pleasure to appreciate the remarkable clarity with which you cut through very complex issues and arguments. You're really a master at that, and you didn't even need your slides. It's very, very, very clear. And I'm very sympathetic to almost everything that you have said, but we come at this from very different disciplinary orientations. You're even though you are a sociologist, but you're writing as a kind of in the domain of normative political theory, and I've been writing about such topics from the perspective of analytical sociology, and we've had discussions about this before. And so, in a sense, when I think I'm returning to an issue that we talked about a quarter of a century ago, the first time, and that is so I'd like to push you a little bit from the point of view of a sociologist who sees the empirical landscape of diversity changing. So I just would like to hear how you think about what I would claim is an empirical development. I would claim that the paradigm of multiculturalism, fits to it. It's adapted to a sociological reality where groups are relatively clear, where there's a fairly clear, bounded sense of clearly bounded, easily identifiable, relatively stable groups. And indeed, these are the groups that you refer to in your talk, to Christians and Jews and Muslims and Sikhs and so on. But what happens when sociologically the diversity is reorganized in much less group-like, groupist manners, when diversifying immigration patterns, when rising intermarriage rates, when increasingly fluid practices of self-identification generate a much more complex landscape of what some theorists have called super diversity, such that people are distributed across a much larger array of less sharply defined categories and find themselves maybe not fitting so well in the standard small number of boxes. Now that's a kind of theoretical question, but it has a practical aspect to it as well. Say, for example, in connection with your discussion of provisions for religious education that groups want. Well, what are the groups? How do we identify the groups? Are they only the big sort of 5 world religion categories? Or what if there's what if there are particular forms of literalist Christians, for example, who want their own religious education, or all the different varieties of Muslims who where does one how does one determine which groups count as groups for the purposes of who gets to be recognized as a group for making these claims? So is there then a potential downside to the pluralistic thickening as opposed to the thinning alternative, which you very nicely and very clearly contrast? I see very clearly the advantages to the additive pluralistic thickening model, but one in a sense, you could say that the thinning, the pluralistic thickening may not, in a certain sense, respect a certain kind of majority culture, insofar as that the tradition of the majority culture is itself toward a kind of thinning. What if that thinning out is part of the historical particularity of the majority culture? Or what about all of those who might be contained within these big categories, but who don't identify with the thick part of it? So I think, it's a two-part question. One, just kind of the tension between the sociological complexity and the kind of clarity of a limited paradigm of a limited number of groups, and then also that some of the practical questions that arise as a result of that complexity, and how one accommodates in the public realm those who precisely, as part of their culture, right, want that thinness.
Yes, thank you, Rogers. And as you say, this is a conversation we're picking up after a number of years, in fact, even decades. And it is a fair point that you make about what we might call the sociological fittingness of what I'm arguing for, because I might be arguing for something that seems very nice and clear and attractive, but it may not fit the world that we live in, or that we're moving in the direction of. So I would say that I am struck by the very high level of identification that people that we think of as members of ethnic minorities, ethno-racial minorities, ethno-religious minorities, so the very high level of identification they have with that minority group. We don't see that really disappearing over time. It may get eroded a little bit, may get splintered. What mainly happens is that it gets complexified and internally differentiated, rather than people saying, this just isn't a group I want to be a member of, or am a member of, or want to be part of, and so on. So I think that in that sense, groups do exist, are continuing to exist, but their nature is changing, and changing in terms of becoming more internally differentiated, and more scope for people redefining themselves, redefining what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be Muslim, what it means to be Black, rather than saying, oh, my parents may have been Jewish or Muslim and Black, but actually I'm not, I'm something else. So that's the first sociological point I would make. Your other remark, your second remark, that actually there are a lot of people who, as it were, are in more than one group, perhaps because of things like intermarriage and friendship circles and, dating and so on. And then, of course, they're bringing up a younger generation, a new generation that is not, as it were, has just got one heritage, one group identity to be transmitted to, and it may be transmitted to, therefore, in different ways, one more than another, or in a more hybridic way, and so on. Again, I think actually in many ways that development is an asset for a multicultural society and a multicultural nationalism, the kind I'm describing, not an obstacle. And the final point about, well, what if a state was to say, okay, we will fund Muslim schools, but what should a Muslim school be like? What should it be doing? And then loads of Muslims come forward with quite different proposals, just as Christians might come up with different proposals. Well, I think we should work with all of them. If some Muslims say, this is my understanding of my faith and the requirements of my faith translated into pedagogy, translated into schooling, then we should look at all of them, which isn't the same thing as to say that this is a carte blanche. Whatever someone asks for, we just go with that. I don't hold that view about anything. I mean, of course, there will be some standards and regulations, and there will be, for instance, a national curriculum and a, you know, national inspectorate.
Tariq, I think we need to go. Sorry,
Yeah,
sorry for
okay.
interrupting.
Well, I think that
Yeah.
was my answer. Yeah.
Yeah. So now a short comment from Rogers to from you to Rogers' talk, and then we will go on with questions from the panelists and from myself as well. And I think we will do it like this, that we have all the questions, and in the end, both of you comment, okay? That's a good way to do it.
Okay.
So, great. So, Tariq, a short comment from you too, to Rogers.
Okay, well, I realize because of the time, I will indeed keep it short. So one's a kind of factual thing. I found what you said very interesting, Rogers, the way that you've connected your understanding of populism to the current politics around the pandemic. I just like to say to you that it did seem quite American, and you did warn us that it would be. In the UK, for instance, it's interesting that there isn't this distrust of expertise in the sense that the government is hoodwinking us into having too much of a lockdown. It's exactly the opposite. There is a large consensus across the political parties that the government hasn't got it right, that the government is relaxing the rules, or the government was ill-prepared and doesn't take the crisis seriously enough, and so on. So just as a factual point, I'll make that. And then the other point was that I thought the way you presented this, as I say, drew on your understanding of populism, for instance, in your essay, Why Populism, rather well. But there was one thing you say in that essay which actually connects with issues of multiculturalism and recognition. You say, populism is keenly attuned to the distribution not only of resources and opportunities, but of honor, respect, and recognition, which may be seen as unjustly withheld from ordinary people and unjustly accorded to the unworthy and undeserving. And I just wondered if you thought that too applied in the present crisis. That's it, you know, if that too applied in your reading of the potentialities of populism in the present crisis.
Okay, thank you. And short answer from you. Thank you, Rogers.
Yes, very sure. Thank you, Tariq. Yes, of course, it's a very, very American story. And there's I mean, there's not one pandemic in the world. There are many, many pandemics, obviously just medically in terms of the course of the disease, but also very interestingly, socially, politically, in terms of public understandings. And the interesting thing for me is the way in which then this kind of epistemic aspect of that links into the medical, right? I mean, so no accident that in East Asia, the citizenry's understanding of the pandemic, you know, is constitutive part of the course of the pandemic, right? With everybody, you know, eagerly wearing masks and so on, that has consequences for the possibilities of control and so on. So yes, this is a very distinctive American story, partly because of the course of the pandemic, that we were a couple of weeks behind Europe, and therefore, you know, started lockdowns much earlier, and therefore did not have the terrible experience of Italy and France and Spain and Britain. And of course, then the critique goes in the opposite direction in the European countries. Why were we so late, etc. So yes, a very different story for both because of this contingencies of place in the pandemic, but also then because of aspects of political culture and American political history and so on. I am concerned about this aspect of populism, you know, kind of this fight about the distribution of respect and so on. And I am concerned, of course, about the view from the heartland, you know, the white working class, et cetera, that somehow this can, you know, feed into a sense of grievance, that yes, it's some kind of alliance between, you know, urban liberals and the minority constituencies for which they speak, and we, the quote, ordinary people, of course, that's a potential and very toxic and divisive aspect of tacit understandings here. But and these understandings can be quite divisive and dangerous, even if they're not explicitly articulated.
Thank you, both of you. I have a question myself, and then I'm not going to let you answer right away, but give the word to several of the panelists, and then you can have a short comment on the end. So I think it's interesting to see also the link between nationalism and populism in our time, and how the corona, but also several of the processes are affecting the resurgence of nationalism, perhaps. And also, I would find it very interesting to go back to the discourses of the death of multiculturalism. How would you look on that now, with Brexit and with Corona and with the so-called refugee crisis and so on and so on? So, but our time is very short, and actually I'm just going to the first panelist today, and that's Professor Garbi Schmidt from Roskilde University. Please, Garbi.
Thank you, and I'll try to be brief. Thank you, first of all, for two really exceptionally wonderful papers I really enjoyed listening to. I got three questions. I tried to be really brief, and they all for Rogers. So first, one thing that you were talking about and that you were also discussing with Tariq afterwards is how easy access to data and research results have become. And that this kind of accessibility, as I understand it, in this situation is quite unconstructive for the debate. But my question is here, what can we, as experts, the people who are actually producing this kind of knowledge, putting it online, as we're supposed to do as academics. I mean, what should we do in that situation? Should we actually withhold research results? Should we silence ourselves in a situation like this? Secondly, when we are talking about overload of information, I would also say there's another problem, at least in the part of the world where I'm sitting, is the kind of information that people have access to. So as you were also saying, Rogers, there's a lot of information and knowledge that is produced by epistemologists and public health experts, and that's also the kind of experts that we see on television. But people are less, also through the media, they got less access to the insights from other academic disciplines, for example, sociologists, anthropology, philosophy, migration research. So I would say there's a lot of blind spots in this debate. Exactly, for example, not least when it comes to the situation of minorities, but also because, I mean, there's certain information that is easily accessible, and there's part of, the flood of information that is simply not there. And then a final thing is, at least, I mean, we see that in Europe, given, the kind of information that we get from the United States, we definitely see that there too. I mean, that populist views in this situation also breed on real suffering. For example,
I think we need to go on because we are so many, and to allow more people. But thank you, Garbi. And then I give the word to Lene Kiele from Aarhus University, Denmark. Please, Lene.
Thank you. My question goes to Rogers. I think, of course, surely it was sort of an American story, but I think there was a lot that resonated with Europe as well. And I really appreciated the way that you explained how everything is sort of upside down now, or a lot of things are upside down in this COVID-19 era. So I wondered, and maybe going along the lines of Catherine's question, I mean, what about nationalism? Is that also upside down? Usually populism and nationalism goes together. Is that the same in this COVID-19 situation?
Well, thank you. Next one on the list is Mark Juergensmeyer from University of California. So please, Professor Mark Juergensmeyer.
I'm wondering if we're entering into a new phase of populist anti-globalization. because just a couple of months ago, populism was populated by a cultural anti-globalization or an economic one. Look at Brexit, for example, resistance against new immigrants, the same kind of anger that fueled the election of Trump in the United States, or movements in Norway, for example, that produced Anders Breivik. But now we're in a different situation. We don't hear much about cultural nationalism. We're in a defensive nationalism, and the populism is looking for some kind of toughness to stand up against this new global threat, which is not immigration, which is not economic, which is a tiny virus, but it's global, it's transnational. And so it's a defensive nationalism that gives the illusion of toughness in the kind of autocratic way, or real toughness, as the Prime Minister of New Zealand, for example, demonstrated. But that's the kind of cult of new populist defensive nationalism that's replacing cultural nationalism. So my question is whether this is just a temporary thing. Of course, we don't know whether the pandemic is a temporary thing. If it's several years, maybe this will replace cultural nationalism, or maybe it will fuse with it in an awful kind of way, where immigrants are blamed in some way, are used as fodder for this, pandemic. It will let them take the brunt of it. But it's an interesting phase in world history, and we may look back on this moment as a fulcrum moment when there has been at least a shift in cultural nationalism, if not the demonization of it, with the new kinds of defensive nationalism.
Thank you very much, Mark. And then we go on to Marco Antoncic from Loughborough University in the UK. Please, Marco.
Thank you, Catherine. Hi, Tariq. Always a pleasure, as Rogers mentioned, to listen to your very clear, very elegant way of phrasing the issues. But obviously, as you know, and this was not the first time presenting this observation to you, what you're talking about is how the nation should look like. So it's very much normative perspective. What we heard from Rogers before are instead how actually nation looks like, not how they should, but actually how they look like. Rogers mentioned in the question that societies have changed now, have become much more individualized. And then I guess you're familiar with the same critique of Ted Cantle in relation to interculturalism. And as you know, obviously there is that debate, so it's nothing new. But I would like to bring back what Rogers was saying, because the kind of nation that he presented, the US nation facing the coronavirus, is very much what Mark was saying, is this kind of defensive, insular type of nationalism, in which majorities are not happy to stay as they are. You mentioned, multicultural nationalism, because it doesn't really touch majority culture. It only simply adds on. What we are observing is that even the addictive is not accepted. I briefly mentioned the examples of Italy. Recently, there was an aid worker that was liberated after 2 years being was kidnapped by Al-Shabaab and lived in Somalia. All Italians, when it was liberated, was cheering for joy. The next day, when they realized that that person converted to Islam, there was outrage, hatred all over. What I'm saying is that I understand and I appreciate the value of any normative theory. I do see the challenge when we go down the empirical. So not proper question, but a big tension there.
Thank you, Marco.
Thank you.
We go on with a question from Professor Peter Bayer, University of Ottawa, Canada. Please, Peter.
Finally. Thank you, both of you. They're very interesting talks. As I was listening to them, I've been making a conscious effort to try to connect them. And as the previous questioners obviously have been doing too. And besides the obvious fact that how we analyze and experience the present COVID situation really depends on what Rogers said right at the beginning, on which space you're in, which country you're in, which part of the country, which social class you belong to, what your particular situation is. The other thing that that has impressed me is the temporal aspect of it, and that is, and this is where I want to bring the multiculturalism in, is that there are certain kinds of debates and certain kinds of issues that hardly seem to have come up yet, including a lot of talk about you know, the obvious challenge this would be for questions of multicultural diversity, unless what one could think of. And they do occasionally pop up, you know, then, okay, this is the fault of those other people, right? But then it just fades away. And it impresses me that we may be in a situation where we really don't have enough information yet to figure out what's going to happen next, and when, say, the multicultural debate and the populism debate are going to meet in a much more integrated fashion than seems to have happened thus far. So my question is really why has this diversity issue, challenging as it often is, not been talked about very much yet? Or am I just being a typical Canadian here and reflecting my situation?
Thank you. So that was all the questions from the panelists, and so then we are going back to Rogers and Tariq. Please, Rogers first. Do you have any comments to those questions?
Sure, thank you. I take the comments clustered around the issue, the comments clustered around the question of nationalism in relation to populism. This was and then Peter's last question on diversity. Katrine, Lena, and Mark were wondering about nationalism. Mark suggested that in place of an older cultural nationalism, we now see a defensive nationalism. I don't think the defensive nationalism is new. I think the defensive nationalism has precisely been characteristic of the nationalism-populism nexus in the last couple of decades. The whole literature on neo-nationalism, which is precisely defensive in this way, organized against putative threats from the outside, right? And hence the argument by many nationalists / populists that the new line of cleavage is not left-right, but open versus closed, and so on. We have to protect the people, meaning in this case, the national people, the nation, against threats from the outside, from unregulated globalization, from unregulated or insufficiently regulated migration, from terrorist threats, and so on. And then, of course, also the threat from circulating viruses. It fits right into that framework of defensive nationalism. It was there before. It's briefly been triggered in earlier pandemics or threatened pandemics, you know, interestingly, you know, now that I said that now we see populism being kind of anti-crisis, anti-protectionist, downplaying the significance of the virus, as long as the virus in this case was seen as something on the outside, right, as the Chinese virus that was still in China, then it was indeed the right and the populists who were first to demand the closures of borders, right? So Trump was pressured by conservative activists into closing entry from China at a time when liberals still thought this was a very bad idea, and public health officials for that matter. And so they, you know, at that moment, as long as it could be defined as an outside threat, they were on it. Trump was also making comments about Ebola in 2013, 2014, when there was concern that it might spread and so on. So yes, this kind of defensive, anti-pathogen, protective nationalism, it fits into this broader pattern of a defensive populist nationalism. But we see then, you know, nationalism also existing in many other ways now in the present. This renationalization of life. I think longer term, certainly a trend towards deglobalization, at least to a certain degree, probably longer term consequences for immigration, et cetera. And then the link between the politics of blame that is seeing the virus as a Chinese virus, as Trump has said, and local, and this connects to Tariq's work, local stigmatization, right? Many Asian Americans have reported, you know, disturbing incidents in everyday life when, you know, people just passing them on the street somehow, you know, treat them as hyper dangerous, or blame, give expressions of blame, or things like that. And then as far as well, I think it's really let me stop here because we only have a few minutes. So.
Okay, thank you very much, Rogers. And then last word to Tariq, please.
Yes, thank you. So I guess my question's also clustered around, well, what is actually happening in terms of multiculturalist discourses and political initiatives, or their opposite, multiculturalism being pushed back, people claiming it's dead, and so on. So, Catherine, you mentioned Brexit in this context. Well, that's interesting because, of course, everybody acknowledges that immigration, in particular, the European freedom of movement, was at the heart of what won the negative vote for leave. But I mean, it wasn't quite so simple in terms of multiculturalism, because no one argued that the EU is good for multiculturalism. We know it's not. British multiculturalism is ahead of anything the EU has to offer. So we didn't think, oh, we're going to lose some multiculturalism if we don't remain in the EU. A lot of people, including ethnic minorities in Britain, saw that they're, looking at their neighborhoods as well as general statistics and so on, that there were a lot of white Europeans coming into the country, whitening the country and competing with other migrants who wanted to come into the country, who might come from outside Europe, but who had a lesser right to come because of freedom of movement and so on. So the multiculturalism is a lot more complicated in relation to Brexit, as opposed to just seeing it as a blow for against multiculturalism. And Marco says, well, there's so much negative about that even something that I'm offering, which he says, look, shouldn't be seen as so radical and controversial, surely is not going to be accepted. Well, I would say, I certainly think there's a lot of contestation, so I'm not saying anything contrary to that. But I think you'd agree with me, Marco, that in the country we've seen a new spirit of solidarity, a surprising spirit of solidarity, especially following the divisions of the last few years over Brexit and so on. And that includes recognizing the role that ethnic minorities and migrants have been playing in the National Health Service and in the other essential work that has to be done while the rest of the country is in lockdown and so on. And to some extent, there is a very sympathetic multiculturalist sentiment that the government is having to respond to by saying, well, those people who are not UK nationals who are working, and as it were, the front line against the pandemic, they'll be given rights of residence, or at the very least, they won't have to pay the extra charges for the use of the NHS and so on, a political reversal that I'm sure you're aware of. So I think that there is enough in the politics, including, of course, the politics being argued for and campaigned for by ethnic minorities and their political allies and so on. I said at the end of my talk, maybe a third of the country has a kind of pro-diversity set of political views. And that's what opinion polls show. That's what electoral results show and so on. And I think that shows that there is a political basis for mobilizing those kinds of views, but they have to be connected to the views outside that third. And in a way, I think that's exactly what I'm trying to do.
Thank you so much. I think we could have gone on and on for a long time, actually. Our time is up. And I would just really like to thank the two speakers for very insightful talks and also the panelists for contributing to an interesting discussion. And then I would like to thank all of you who had joined us in this global webinar. So for us in Northern Europe, it's have a good evening. For the rest of you, it's maybe have a good night or a good day. And I hope to see you again soon.